Hello, I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, joined by our City Hall columnist, Dan Fumano. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Harold.
So you and colleague Laurie Colbert wrote a very interesting and frankly concerning feature last week that identified a trend in Metro Vancouver's extremely tight and expensive rental market. What is this trend and where are you getting that information?
So the story we wrote was kind of built around a survey that First United had done. First United, longtime social justice kind of organization operating out of Vancouver's downtown east side. And they had been doing this project for a couple of years now, where they were polling British Columbians who had been evicted and trying to get some details about the circumstances of their eviction. And so they're talking to people all over the province, figuring out why were they evicted, what happened after the eviction, where did they go, and what happened to them, and looking at different parts of the province, not just in Vancouver, but all around. And it wasn't like a scientific survey, but they had like 700 responses, so it's a not
Right.
insignificant amount of data. And one of the things they found that we thought was interesting that we focused on was there's this pretty significant amount of tenants with higher incomes, moderate or even above average incomes, that are being evicted. And if you talk to people who work in tenancy disputes or are in this world, that's not super surprising because a lot of the data shows that the number of evictions for non-payment of rent is actually a pretty small number of the overall evictions. Um, People do get evicted when they fail to pay their rent. That happens. But a lot of evictions happen for other reasons, both formal evictions that go through the formal process, as well as informal evictions where a landlord, um, often a landlord or their representative might just tell a tenant, hey, you need to move out at the end of next month because XYZ, because my son or daughter is going to move into the unit, or I'm going to move into the unit, or we're demolishing it to build something new. And in some cases, it's not written down and not going through the formal process. So that was kind of one of the things First United was trying to get at is finding out, trying to get a sense of how many informal evictions are happening out there. Because, of course, if they happen informally, the government and the residential tenancy branch might never know about these things, right? So it provides visibility, a little bit of visibility into parts of this that the residential tenancy branch isn't necessarily seeing. Because another finding they had was that most most of the respondents to the survey who got evicted, they never filed an application to the residential tenancy branch, and a lot of them didn't know it existed.
Right, right. So that's an interesting phenomenon, the people being evicted so that people say they can move someone in or they need the suite themselves. And I guess that's a problem because we are very reliant, aren't we, here, perhaps more than many other places,
Yeah.
on secondary suites for rental as opposed to purpose-built rental. So why is that? Or this just is evolved?
Yeah. So, yeah, as you say, a lot of renters in BC, especially in Metro Vancouver, don't live in purpose-built like apartment buildings. They live in a condo or a house or a basement suite that an individual often owns and rents out. So this forms a hugely important, and I think it's more than half of our overall rental market in Metro Vancouver, anyways, is this kind of secondary market. A big reason for that is that over the last few decades, Vancouver, like most Canadian cities, just built very little rental housing. There
Right.
was a huge boom in condo construction, um, and there were a lot of new houses getting built, and a lot of those end up getting rented out, and they become rental homes. But the tenants living there don't have the same security of tenure that you have in a purpose-built rental building. So something that First United found, and this has been borne out by lots of other findings, is that tenants are more likely to face eviction if they live in a rented house or a rented condo as opposed to an apartment building. And it's important to note that that doesn't mean that all of those are bad faith illegal evictions. But if you live in a rented condo or a rented house or whatever, there's a higher chance that you might get evicted through legitimate means as well. If you live in a rented condo and the owner sells it and the new buyer genuinely wants to live there, then the tenants only have they only have 2 months to find under the law, the way it's written. If the new owner wants to move in or move an immediate family member, and if everything's totally above board and they're acting totally according to the rules, they are allowed to live there. And they just have to give a 2 month notice of tenancy, which isn't a ton of time to
No.
find a new rental home in this kind of a market. You can imagine it. So obviously, bad faith, illegal evictions are a concern, and tenants advocates and a lot of people like First United who work in this world are really worried about bad faith evictions. And I think the landlord industry doesn't want bad faith evictions either. They don't want the bad actors out there. But I think it's important, the way that the market is right now, even good faith, like totally legitimate evictions, can create a lot of havoc for families and renters. So, and those are happening a lot where, with interest rates rising so much so quickly, if you have a small scale landlord who owns one rented condo that they rent out, and if they've got a variable rate mortgage, pretty quickly they might be losing money every month if the rent doesn't cover their monthly fees. So they might decide to sell, which they're allowed to do, but the person they sell it to might decide they want to live in that condo, which then could lead to an eviction. So yeah, again, you just have this situation where the vast majority of the purpose-built rental housing in Vancouver was built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And then there was very little rental housing built for a few decades. And governments have tried in the last decade or so to reverse that trend and try to implement policies to encourage more rental construction. Especially you've seen that in Vancouver and some other municipalities where they're really trying to push the market to build more rental housing. But that's relatively recent development,
Right.
and it's
If
tricky, as
if
we know. That's not without its challenges.
no, if a condo owner, in your example, if a condo owner sells to someone else when they have an existing tenant, does that existing tenant's rights transfer to the new owner in terms of the cap on rent increases?
Oh yeah, I believe
Yes.
so. I mean, I'm not 100%,
Okay.
but that's my understanding is that they would still
Okay.
be subject to the same protections.
Okay.
If someone buys a tenanted home, um, yeah, I think
Okay.
they would take
Then it
the
applies the same.
existing
But of
tenancy.
course, if a tenant moves out, then a new tenant moves in anywhere, then there's no cap that they can start
No,
from zero, right? And whatever the
well,
market will bear,
they could double or triple the rent or whatever.
right?
Yeah, whatever the market will bear.
We definitely see that happening, obviously, because the
Yes.
rates of rents are going up higher than the caps in a lot of areas, right?
Oh, way higher. I mean, the cap is only
Yeah,
what, 3.5% for next year, I think.
right.
And it's not uncommon that, yeah, if a long-term tenant moves out, um, and they were paying way below market rent, then it's the monthly rent on an apartment could easily double. Um,
So
in
what are
certain
some of the
cases.
things that First United and some of the other rental advocates, what are some of the things that they think government could do to bring in protections either at the city or provincial level? Is there anything more that can be done that's not being done
Yeah,
now?
First United had a series of recommendations, proposed law reforms, and you can read the whole list
Yeah.
on their website. But one of the sort of key ones is around what's called vacancy control. So as you asked about just there, with an existing tenant, um, there's a maximum amount that the landlord is allowed to increase the rent, and it's set every year by the provincial government. I think for next year, I think it's 3.5%. But if that tenant moves out and a new tenant moves in, there's no limit to how much you can increase the rent. Now, tenants advocates say that this puts too much pressure, or there's too much incentive, um, for landlords sometimes to uh, legally push out existing tenants because there's this profit motive where if they could double or triple the rent, they're going to be making way more money. So one of the key things First United is recommending is vacancy control, which is essentially tying the maximum allowable increase not to the tenant, but to the unit. So regardless of whether it's an existing tenant or a brand new tenant, there's some limit on how much you can increase the rent. Now, BC's housing minister and the premier, the former housing minister, have said that they don't currently plan on implementing vacancy control because they worry that this would discourage new rental housing from getting built. That has long been sort of the debate. If you implement these stricter kind of rent controls, like this vacancy control, Is that going to mean that no one's going to invest, no one's going to build new rental housing?
Right.
And the province wants to get a lot more rental housing built through the private sector. David Eby has said, the governments just can't build enough on their own to meet the demand. They need the private sector to build a lot of this stuff, and they're afraid that will not happen if they implement vacancy control.
I see. Yeah. So it's a bit of a, you don't want to tilt too far one way or the other, because you could have unintended consequences, in terms of dampening the market, or for people wanting to rent, I guess. But
Yeah.
what is the situation now in terms of rental housing? What does the landscape look like? Are we seeing much in the way of new construction?
Well, it's a challenging environment. And so, I mean, the city of Vancouver, as mentioning them as an example of a government that over the last few council terms, last decade or so, they've implemented a series of policies meant at incentivizing the private sector to build purpose-built rental housing, often with some below market component. Some percentage of the rooms would be rented below market rates. And so they have been trumpeting. They've, year over year, the last few years, they keep having record number of rental housing approvals, right? The city's approved this many thousands of units in a given year, and say that's the most the city's approved for construction in however many decades or in recent memory. And so they keep touting these approvals, but then some other people in the industry are saying, well, not all of those approvals end up being completions, right? So something gets approved one year, and then if everything goes according to plan, construction begins a little later, construction finishes, and then it becomes someone's home. The challenge is now you've got projects that maybe have just been approved, but the project was conceived of a few years ago because the amount of time it takes to get through the approvals process. So it was conceived in a very different financial environment when construction costs were very different than they are now. Interest rates obviously were way lower. And so rental demand is still very high, but it's just so much more expensive and difficult to build these projects. So there are worries out there that some projects that have been approved in the last year or two, it might be a long time before they get built, if at all. And then, of course, Metro Vancouver has recently significantly increased its development cost charges, including for rentals. And so people worry that that might also dampen the future supply of rental building. At the end of the day, we rely so much on the private sector to build our housing in this country, much more than, some countries. Some countries have a much more robust kind of stock of publicly owned housing. But we rely on the private sector for so much of our housing, including rental housing. So these companies are not going to move ahead with projects that are going to lose them money. That they're not in the business of losing money. So they're going to wait and see. In some cases, they might potentially do other kinds of projects in other markets, because a lot of our big builders are active in many cities outside of Vancouver or BC. So it is a big question right now. And we are hearing from people in the development industry that, with all these costs going up, all this uncertainty, they might be doing a bit of wait and see. If they've already broken ground and there's cranes and the construction site is there, those will continue moving forward. But we are hearing some trepidation in the current market, with people wondering if they should move forward.
Right. Well, we will wait and see. Thanks, Dan. And
Thanks,
no
Earl.
council this week, but we'll see you next week.
Back next
we'll
week.
have lots to talk about, whatever's on the agenda.
Definitely.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks.